Sarah Martinez stepped out of her silver Honda Accord, juggling grocery bags while trying to fish her house keys from her purse. The afternoon sun beat down on Maple Ridge Drive, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns of their suburban neighborhood. She had lived in this quiet community for 3 years now with her husband Marcus, a retired Navy SEAL who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before settling into civilian life as a security consultant. The neighborhood had always prided itself on maintaining high standards. Every lawn was kept pristine, every mailbox painted in approved colors, and every driveway free of oil stains. The Homeowners Association made sure of that. Sarah had initially appreciated the order and beauty of their community, but lately, the HOA's enforcement had become increasingly aggressive and petty. As she walked toward her front door, Sarah noticed a bright orange notice taped to her mailbox post. Her heart sank. Another violation notice. She set down her grocery bags and carefully peeled off the paper, reading the typed message with growing frustration. Violation notice. Your garden hose was observed coiled incorrectly in your front yard on September 8th at 2:30 p.m. Per Community Guidelines Section 4.7, all garden equipment must be stored out of public view. This is your second violation. Fine. $75. Please remedy immediately or face additional penalties. Sarah shook her head in disbelief. The garden hose had been neatly coiled near her front flower bed while she watered her roses that morning. She had forgotten to put it away before running to the grocery store, and apparently, that 20-minute oversight had cost her $75. This was the latest in a series of increasingly ridiculous violations. Last month, they had been fined for leaving their garbage can out 30 minutes past the pickup deadline. The month before, it was for having a small oil stain on their driveway that Marcus was already planning to clean. The HOA seemed to be watching their every move, waiting for the smallest infraction. Marcus had grown increasingly irritated with the situation. His military background had taught him to follow rules and maintain discipline, but these weren't reasonable regulations anymore. They were harassment disguised as community standards. He had suggested they attend the next HOA meeting to address their concerns, but Sarah preferred to avoid confrontation when possible. The HOA board was led by Patricia Williams, a stern woman in her 60s who had moved to the neighborhood 5 years ago and quickly positioned herself as the unofficial queen of Maple Ridge Drive. She had been elected board president after running unopposed, promising to maintain the exceptional standards that make our community the envy of the county. Patricia lived 3 houses down from the Martinez family in a sprawling 2-story colonial that she kept immaculate. Her lawn was the greenest on the block, her flower beds perfectly symmetrical, and her white picket fence painted so regularly it seemed to gleam. She took her role as HOA president seriously, perhaps too seriously, and had assembled a team of like-minded residents who shared her vision of suburban perfection. The enforcement team included Robert Chen, a recently retired accountant who enjoyed the authority his position gave him, and Beverly Thompson, a middle-aged woman who had made documenting neighborhood violations her full-time hobby since her children left for college. Together, they patrolled the streets in Beverly's white minivan, armed with cameras, measuring tapes, and citation books. Sarah crumpled the violation notice and walked into her house, calling out to Marcus as she set the groceries on the kitchen counter. He emerged from his home office where he had been reviewing security protocols for a new client. At 42, Marcus still maintained the disciplined physique and alert demeanor of his military days. His dark hair was now touched with gray at the temples, and his brown eyes held the steady gaze of someone who had faced real danger and real responsibility. "Let me guess," he said, noticing her expression. "Another love letter from the HOA?" Sarah handed him the citation, watching his jaw tighten as he read it. $75 for a garden hose, she said. "Marcus, this is getting out of hand. They're treating us like criminals." Marcus had dealt with actual threats during his military service. He had navigated complex political situations in foreign countries and had been responsible for the safety of his team in hostile environments. The idea that he was now being harassed over minor household oversights in his own neighborhood struck him as both absurd and infuriating. "This stops now," he said quietly. "We pay our dues, we maintain our property, and we've been good neighbors. This isn't about community standards anymore. This is about power and control." That evening, Marcus researched the HOA's bylaws and discovered several concerning patterns. The fines had increased dramatically since Patricia's election. The violation categories had expanded to include increasingly subjective standards. Most troubling, the appeals process seemed designed to discourage challenges, requiring multiple meetings and extensive documentation for even minor disputes. Sarah watched her husband work. Recognizing the focused intensity he brought to problems that needed solving, she knew that look. It was the same expression he wore when he was planning security strategies for high-profile clients or analyzing potential threats. The HOA had no idea they had just declared war on someone with extensive training in tactical thinking and conflict resolution. The next morning, Patricia Williams stood in her driveway, clipboard in hand, directing Robert and Beverly as they documented what appeared to be a loose board on the Martinez fence. She had noticed it during her morning walk and wanted it properly recorded before issuing another citation. The fence board was barely noticeable, but community standards were community standards. Marcus observed them from his kitchen window, noting their positioning, their equipment, and their methodology. He had spent years analyzing enemy movements and identifying weak points in defensive positions. Now he found himself applying those same skills to a suburban HOA dispute. The irony wasn't lost on him, but the principle remained the same. When someone initiated aggressive action against you, the best response was strategic and decisive. Sarah joined him at the window, watching their neighbors document their property like investigators at a crime scene. "What are you thinking?" she asked. Marcus took her hand. "I'm thinking it's time we reminded them that some people don't back down when pushed." Marcus spent the weekend researching HOA law and community regulations, with the same thoroughness he had once applied to intelligence gathering. He discovered that Patricia's enforcement team had been operating outside their authority in several key areas. The fines they were issuing exceeded the amount specified in the original HOA agreement, and their inspection methods violated residents' privacy rights under state law. More concerning was what he found in the public records. The HOA's finances showed unusual patterns of spending, with substantial payments to Patricia's landscaping company and Robert's accounting firm. The community's reserve fund, meant for emergency repairs and improvements, had dwindled significantly over the past 2 years, while enforcement revenue had increased by 300%. On Monday morning, Marcus visited the office of Janet Reynolds, a local attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. Janet was a sharp woman in her 50s who had built her practice defending homeowners against overreaching community associations. Her office walls were lined with victory certificates and thank you letters from grateful clients. "Mr. Martinez," Janet said, reviewing the stack of violation notices Marcus had brought. "This is systematic harassment. The pattern of targeting, the excessive fines, the unreasonable enforcement standards. You have grounds for a lawsuit." Marcus nodded. "That's good to know, but I'm hoping we can resolve this without litigation. I'd like to try addressing it directly with the board first." Janet raised an eyebrow. "In my experience, boards like this don't respond well to reasonable discussion. They see any challenge as a threat to their authority." "Maybe," Marcus said. "But they haven't dealt with someone like me before." That afternoon, Marcus submitted a formal complaint to the HOA board, requesting a hearing to dispute the recent violations. He cited specific sections of the community bylaws that had been misapplied and included documentation of similar cases in other neighborhoods where courts had ruled against HOA overreach. His letter was professional, but firm, making it clear he understood both his rights and the board's limitations. Patricia received the complaint at her home office, where she managed both her HOA duties and her landscaping business. She read Marcus's letter twice, her irritation growing with each paragraph. In 5 years as board president, no one had challenged her authority so directly or demonstrated such detailed knowledge of HOA law. She immediately called Robert and Beverly for an emergency meeting. They gathered in Patricia's living room, surrounded by binders full of violation reports and community regulations. "He thinks he can intimidate us with legal threats," Patricia said, waving Marcus's letter. "We've worked too hard to build proper standards in this neighborhood to let one troublemaker undermine everything we've accomplished." Beverly nodded eagerly. "I've been watching their house. The wife left her car parked slightly over their driveway line yesterday. That's a violation of the parking guidelines. Robert pulled out his calculator. If we escalate to daily fines for ongoing violations, we could assess penalties up to $500 per week. Patricia smiled coldly. Let's show Mr. Martinez. What happens when residents don't respect community leadership? The harassment escalated immediately. Over the next week, the Martinez family received 7 violation notices for increasingly petty infractions. Their newspaper was delivered 3 inches onto their neighbor's property line. Their mailbox flag was observed in the up position for longer than the recommended maximum. Sarah's car was parked with its front bumper extending 2 inches beyond their driveway's edge. Each violation came with escalating fines and increasingly aggressive language. The notices were no longer simply informing them of rule violations. They were threatening legal action, property liens, and forced compliance measures. Sarah felt the stress building. She was a kindergarten teacher who spent her days helping 5-year-olds learn to share and play nicely together. Coming home to find fresh violation notices every day was wearing her down emotionally. She had trouble sleeping and found herself checking and double-checking every aspect of their property maintenance before leaving the house. Marcus watched his wife's stress levels increase and felt his own anger building. He had spent years protecting people from real threats, and now he was watching his wife suffer anxiety attacks because of a power-hungry HOA president who couldn't tolerate being questioned. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon when Sarah arrived home from school to find Patricia, Robert, and Beverly standing in her driveway, measuring the distance between her car and the property line with a metal measuring tape. "Excuse me," Sarah said, approaching the group. "Is there a problem?" Patricia looked up from her clipboard without smiling. "We're documenting another parking violation, Mrs. Martinez. Your vehicle is parked in clear violation of community standards." Sarah looked at her car, which appeared to be parked normally in the center of her own driveway. "I don't understand. The car's on my property in my driveway." "The front bumper extends beyond the approved setback line," Robert explained, pointing to a barely visible mark on the concrete. "According to Section 6.3 of the Vehicle Guidelines, no part of any vehicle may extend beyond the designated parking area." Sarah felt her patience snap. "This is ridiculous. You're measuring my car's position down to the inch on my own property." Beverly stepped forward with her camera, snapping photos of Sarah and the car. "We're simply enforcing the rules that everyone agreed to follow." "I never agreed to harassment," Sarah replied, her voice rising. "This has gone from community standards to personal persecution." Patricia's expression hardened. "Mrs. Martinez, if you can't follow simple rules, perhaps this neighborhood isn't the right fit for your family." The confrontation was interrupted by Marcus emerging from the house. He had been watching from the kitchen window and had seen enough. His military training had taught him to assess situations quickly and respond appropriately to threats. 3. People standing in his driveway, photographing his wife and making veiled threats about their residence constituted a threat that required immediate response. "Ladies, gentlemen," Marcus said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. "I need you to leave my property immediately." Patricia straightened her shoulders. "We have every right to inspect and document violations of community standards." Marcus stepped closer, and something in his posture made Robert take an unconscious step backward. "You have the right to observe from public property. You do not have the right to trespass on my driveway, photograph my family, or threaten our residents." The 3 HOA enforcers found themselves facing a man who radiated the kind of quiet competence that came from years of handling genuinely dangerous situations. Marcus wasn't raising his voice or making threats, but his presence was commanding, in a way that made them suddenly aware they were out of their depth. "We'll be back," Patricia said, gathering her measuring tape and clipboard. "Your hearing is scheduled for next Tuesday at 7 p.m. I suggest you prepare to explain your attitude toward community cooperation." As they walked away, Marcus put his arm around Sarah's shoulders. The battle lines were now clearly drawn. The HOA hearing was scheduled for Tuesday evening in the community center, a modest building that served multiple neighborhoods for meetings and events. Marcus arrived 30 minutes early, carrying a folder of documents and a small digital recorder. He had prepared for this meeting like a military briefing, anticipating possible scenarios and preparing appropriate responses. Sarah sat beside him, nervously fidgeting with her purse strap. Several neighbors had shown up to observe, including Tom and Linda Harrison from across the street, who had received their own string of violation notices in recent months. The room felt tense, like a courtroom before a controversial trial. Patricia entered precisely at 7 p.m., flanked by Robert and Beverly, along with two other board members Marcus hadn't met. Dorothy Nash, an elderly woman who seemed to defer to Patricia in all matters, and James Wilson, a younger man who worked in insurance and appeared uncomfortable with the evening's proceedings. Patricia called the meeting to order and read the charges against the Martinez family with theatrical formality, multiple violations of community standards, failure to comply with corrective measures, and disrespectful behavior toward authorized HOA personnel. Marcus listened patiently as Patricia presented her case, documenting each violation with photographs and measurements. Her presentation was thorough, but revealed the obsessive nature of her surveillance. She had pictures of their garbage can from multiple angles, measurements of their garden hose's position, and even timestamps showing exactly when their newspaper had been retrieved each morning. When Patricia finished, she looked at Marcus expectantly. "Mr. Martinez, you requested this hearing to dispute our findings. Please present your defense." Marcus stood up, his military bearing immediately commanding attention from everyone in the room. He had addressed joint task forces, congressional committees, and hostile foreign officials. A neighborhood HOA meeting was not going to intimidate him. "Thank you, Ms. Williams," he began. "I've reviewed each violation notice carefully, and I've also researched the legal authority behind your enforcement actions." He opened his folder and pulled out a copy of the original HOA agreement signed when the neighborhood was established. According to the founding documents of this community association, fines for minor violations are capped at $25 per incident. The $75 penalties you've been assessing exceed your legal authority by 200%. Patricia's face flushed. "The board has the right to adjust penalties to ensure compliance." "Actually, you don't," Marcus replied calmly. "Any changes to fine structures require a community-wide vote according to Section 12 of these same bylaws." "When was that vote held?" Robert shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "The board has discussed adjusting the penalty structure." "Discussed isn't the same as voted," Marcus continued. "I've also reviewed your inspection methods. Taking photographs on private property without consent, measuring personal property without permission, and documenting residents' daily activities constitute harassment under state law." He pulled out another document. "I've spoken with attorney Janet Reynolds, who specializes in HOA law. She's reviewed your violation notices and enforcement methods. Her legal opinion is that this board has exceeded its authority and engaged in systematic harassment of residents who dare to question your decisions." The room had grown completely quiet. Several neighbors were taking notes, and James Wilson was staring at his hands, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Marcus wasn't finished. "I've also requested financial records from the county clerk's office. Public records show that HOA funds have been spent in ways that appear to benefit board members personally. Ms. Williams, your landscaping company has received over $40,000 in community funds over the past 2 years. Mr. Chen, your accounting firm has been paid $15,000 for services that typically cost $3,000 annually." Patricia stood up abruptly. "Those are legitimate business expenses voted on by the board." "Voted on by a board that benefits financially from those votes," Marcus replied. "That's called a conflict of interest, and it's illegal under state HOA regulations." The tension in the room was palpable. Dorothy Nash was whispering urgently to Patricia, while James Wilson was now openly staring at the documents Marcus had referenced. Several neighbors were exchanging meaningful glances, clearly learning information that surprised them. Beverly tried to regain control. "Mr. Martinez, these accusations are completely inappropriate for a violation hearing." Marcus turned to face her directly. "Mrs. Thompson, you've been photographing my family, documenting our daily activities, and trespassing on our property. If we're talking about inappropriate behavior, perhaps we should discuss your stalking activities." "I am not stalking anyone," Beverly protested. "You have 43 photographs of my house and property taken over the past month," Marcus replied, pulling out another folder. "I've documented every time you've driven past our home, stopped to take pictures, or positioned yourself to observe our activities. In any other context, this would be considered harassment and stalking." Sarah watched her husband methodically dismantle the HOA's case with the same precision she had seen him apply to business problems. He wasn't losing his temper or making personal attacks. He was simply presenting facts in a way that exposed the board's overreach and questionable methods. James Wilson finally spoke up. "Mr. Martinez, if what you're saying is accurate, this board may have created legal liability for the entire community association." "That's correct," Marcus replied. "Any lawsuits resulting from illegal enforcement actions would be paid from community funds, affecting every resident's property values and financial obligations." Patricia realized she was losing control of the meeting. "This hearing is about your violations, not board operations." "Actually," Marcus said, pulling out his digital recorder, "this hearing is about due process and legal authority. Since you've failed to establish either, I'm formally demanding that all violation notices against my family be withdrawn and that this board submit to an independent audit of its finances and enforcement practices." He looked around the room at the other residents. "I'm also requesting a community-wide vote of no confidence in the current board leadership." The room erupted in murmured conversations as neighbors began discussing what they had heard. Tom Harrison stood up and said, "I'd like to second that motion. We've been dealing with the same harassment." Linda Harrison added, "We received 8 violation notices last month alone. Our attorney bills are higher than our mortgage payments." More residents began speaking up, sharing similar experiences with excessive fines, aggressive enforcement, and questionable board decisions. Patricia realized that Marcus hadn't just defended himself. He had exposed the board's methods to community scrutiny and given other residents permission to voice their own complaints. Dorothy Nash was frantically shuffling through papers, clearly looking for some procedure that might allow them to regain control of the situation. Robert was calculating something on his phone, probably trying to determine the financial implications of Marcus's accusations. Marcus sat back down and took Sarah's hand. The first phase of his counteroffensive was complete. He had established that the board was operating outside its legal authority, exposed potential financial improprieties, and demonstrated that their enforcement methods constituted harassment. More importantly, he had shown other residents that the board's power wasn't absolute and that their methods could be challenged. Patricia called for a brief recess, but the damage was done. As residents filed out of the community center, they were forming small groups and sharing their own HOA horror stories. The board's authority had been fundamentally challenged, and everyone present had witnessed it. The morning after the hearing, Patricia Williams paced her living room like a caged animal. Everything she had worked to build over 5 years was being threatened by one resident who refused to accept proper authority. The other board members had called her repeatedly since the meeting ended, all expressing concerns about the legal implications of Marcus's accusations. James Wilson had been particularly troubling. He worked in insurance and understood liability issues better than the others. His phone call at 7 a.m. had been blunt. "Patricia, if even half of what Martinez said is true, we could be facing personal lawsuits and criminal charges. The community association's insurance won't cover illegal actions by board members." Dorothy Nash was panicking about the financial audit Marcus had demanded. As board treasurer, she had signed off on all the payments to Patricia's landscaping company and Robert's accounting firm without questioning the amounts. The idea of having those transactions scrutinized by an independent auditor terrified her. Robert Chen was running calculations on potential legal fees and settlement costs. His accounting background told him that defending against Marcus's allegations would cost more than the community association could afford, especially if other residents joined the challenge. But Patricia wasn't ready to surrender. She had worked too hard to establish her authority in Maple Ridge Drive to let it be destroyed by some troublemaker with a military background and legal knowledge. If Marcus wanted a war, she was prepared to give him one. She called Beverly Thompson, who arrived at Patricia's house within 20 minutes, armed with her camera and a notebook full of surveillance observations. Together, they developed a strategy that would either force Marcus to back down or give them grounds to take more aggressive action against his family. "We need to provoke him," Patricia explained. "If we can get him to lose his temper or make threats, we can involve the police and have him arrested for intimidation." Beverly nodded eagerly. "I've been documenting everything. His wife parks incorrectly almost every day. Their garbage can sit out longer than allowed. Their dog walker doesn't clean up properly. They decided to intensify their enforcement activities while simultaneously filing complaints with the county about Marcus's threatening behavior at the hearing. Patricia also planned to consult with her lawyer about obtaining a restraining order that would prevent Marcus from attending future HOA meetings. Marcus, meanwhile, was implementing the second phase of his strategic response. He had contacted Janet Reynolds about filing a formal lawsuit against the HOA board, and she was preparing a comprehensive complaint that would seek both financial damages and injunctive relief against the board's harassment practices. More importantly, Marcus was building a coalition of residents who had been victims of the board's overreach. Tom and Linda Harrison had provided him with copies of their violation notices, which showed the same pattern of excessive fines and questionable enforcement that his family had experienced. 3 other families had approached him after the hearing, each sharing similar stories of HOA harassment. The Patel family had been fined repeatedly for cultural decorations that were actually traditional Indian flowers planted in their front garden. The Morrison family had received violations for their teenage son's basketball hoop, which was supposedly in violation of recreational equipment guidelines. The elderly Kowalski couple had been cited for having their pharmacy delivery truck parked in their driveway for longer than 10 minutes. Marcus organized these families into a formal group and helped them document their experiences for potential legal action. He also researched similar cases in other communities and found a pattern of successful lawsuits against HOA boards that had exceeded their authority. Sarah supported her husband's efforts, but worried about the escalating conflict. As a teacher, she preferred resolution through communication and compromise. The adversarial nature of the dispute was stressing her, especially when she noticed Patricia's car driving slowly past their house multiple times each day. The situation exploded on Friday afternoon when Sarah came home from school to find Patricia and Beverly standing in her backyard, photographing her garden shed and measuring its distance from the property line. They had entered through the unlocked gate without permission and were treating her private property like a public inspection site. "What are you doing in my backyard?" Sarah demanded, dropping her school bag and approaching the 2 women. Patricia held up her camera defensively. "We received a complaint that your storage shed violates setback requirements. We're documenting the violation." "You're trespassing on my property," Sarah replied, her teacher's authority voice cutting through Patricia's explanation. "I want you to leave immediately." Beverly stepped forward aggressively. "We have every right to inspect HOA violations wherever they occur. Not on private property without permission, you don't," Sarah said, positioning herself between the women and her house. The confrontation escalated when Patricia tried to push past Sarah to photograph the back of the shed. Sarah blocked her path and Patricia shoved her aside with both hands, causing Sarah to stumble backward and fall onto her patio, scraping her elbow on the concrete. "Get away from me," Sarah shouted, more from shock than pain. Beverly immediately started photographing Sarah on the ground, claiming she was documenting Sarah's aggressive behavior for their report. Patricia continued taking pictures of the shed, ignoring Sarah's injury and demands that they leave her property. The situation would have escalated further if Marcus hadn't arrived home at that moment. He parked his truck in the driveway and immediately assessed the scene, his wife sitting on the patio with a bleeding elbow, 2 women in his backyard taking photographs, and clear signs of a physical altercation. Marcus's military training kicked in automatically. He identified a threat to his family, evaluated the tactical situation, and moved to neutralize the danger. He approached the backyard with the controlled urgency of someone who had dealt with hostile situations professionally. "Ladies, you need to leave my property right now," he said, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of command that had once ordered troops into combat. Patricia spun around, her camera still in hand. "We're conducting an official HOA inspection. You're trespassing and you've just assaulted my wife," Marcus replied, moving to help Sarah stand up. "Leave immediately or I'm calling the police." Beverly raised her camera to photograph Marcus, which proved to be a serious mistake. Marcus had been photographed by hostile forces before, and he understood that documentation could be used as intelligence against him and his family. He reacted instinctively, stepping forward and firmly pushing Beverly's camera away from his face. The physical contact was minimal, Marcus simply redirected the camera downward, but Beverly dramatically fell backward, claiming she had been violently attacked. Patricia immediately started screaming about assault and battery, while continuing to photograph the entire encounter. "You just assaulted a woman," Patricia shrieked. "I'm calling the police right now." Marcus realized he had been maneuvered into exactly the situation Patricia wanted. She had trespassed on his property, assaulted his wife, and then provoked him into physical contact that she could characterize as an attack. His military experience told him he was facing an enemy who had planned this confrontation carefully. Sarah was now standing beside him, her elbow still bleeding, but more concerned about the legal implications of what had just happened. "Marcus, they set this up." "I know," he replied, helping her toward the house. "But it doesn't matter now. They got what they came for." Patricia was already on her phone with 911, reporting that she and Beverly had been violently assaulted by an aggressive resident with military training while conducting routine community inspections. Her dramatic account made the incident sound like a terrorist attack rather than a backyard confrontation over property rights. 2 police cruisers arrived at the Martinez house within 15 minutes, their red and blue lights drawing curious neighbors out of their homes. Officer David Chen, a 10-year veteran of the suburban police force, took the lead on the call. He had responded to domestic disputes, neighborhood conflicts, and HOA complaints before, but the dramatic nature of Patricia's 911 call had suggested something more serious than typical community association drama. Patricia immediately approached Officer Chen with Beverly beside her, both women speaking rapidly about being brutally attacked while performing their official duties. Patricia's theatrical description painted Marcus as a dangerous veteran who had snapped and become violent when confronted about rule violations. "Officer, this man has military training and he used it to assault 2 defenseless women," Patricia declared, pointing dramatically at Marcus. "He's been threatening the HOA board and intimidating residents for weeks." Beverly nodded vigorously, holding her wrist as if it were injured. "He grabbed my camera and shoved me to the ground. I think my wrist might be broken." Officer Chen observed the scene professionally. He noted that both women appeared uninjured despite their claims, while Sarah Martinez clearly had a scraped and bleeding elbow. His partner, Officer Rodriguez, was interviewing Marcus and Sarah separately to get their version of events. Marcus remained calm and cooperative, understanding that his military background could work against him if he appeared defensive or aggressive. "Officer, these women trespassed on my property, assaulted my wife, and then tried to provoke a confrontation they could use against me legally." He showed Officer Chen the scrape on Sarah's elbow and explained the sequence of events clearly and factually. "My wife came home to find them in our backyard without permission. When she asked them to leave, one of them pushed her down. I arrived, asked them to leave, and when one of them tried to photograph me, I redirected her camera away from my face." Officer Rodriguez was getting a similar account from Sarah, whose story matched her husband's exactly. As a teacher, Sarah was experienced in dealing with conflict situations and presented her version of events calmly and clearly. "They were trespassing, officer," Sarah explained. "I asked them to leave multiple times, and when I tried to block them from going further into my yard, Patricia shoved me down. I have witnesses from my classroom training that physical contact like that constitutes assault." Officer Chen was beginning to see inconsistencies in Patricia's account. If Marcus had violently attacked 2 women as she claimed, there should be visible injuries, damaged property, or signs of a serious altercation. Instead, he saw 2 uninjured women making dramatic accusations against a man who was cooperating fully with the investigation, requested identification from all parties, and ran background checks on everyone involved. Marcus's military record showed multiple commendations for service and no history of violence or criminal behavior. Patricia's record showed 3 previous complaints filed against neighbors, all involving HOA disputes that had been dismissed by the courts. The situation became more complicated when Tom Harrison approached from across the street. "Officer, I saw the whole thing from my kitchen window. Those 2 women were in the Martinez's backyard without permission. They've been harassing multiple families in this neighborhood for months." Other neighbors began gathering, and several offered to provide witness statements supporting Marcus and Sarah's version of events. Linda Harrison had recorded part of the confrontation on her cell phone after hearing the shouting. The video clearly showed Patricia pushing Sarah down and both women continuing to photograph the Martinez property. Despite being asked to leave, Officer Chen reviewed Linda's video footage and realized that Patricia had misrepresented the entire incident. The video showed Sarah being pushed to the ground by Patricia, not the other way around. It also showed Marcus's minimal contact with Beverly's camera, which hardly constituted the violent assault Patricia had described. "Ma'am," Officer Chen addressed Patricia, "this video evidence contradicts your statement. It shows you pushing Mrs. Martinez down, not Mr. Martinez attacking you." Patricia's confident demeanor began to crack. "That video doesn't show the full context. These people have been threatening us for weeks. We were in fear for our safety." "If you were in fear for your safety, why did you enter their private property without permission?" Officer Rodriguez asked. Beverly tried to support Patricia's story. "We have every right to inspect HOA violations on any property in the community." Officer Chen shook his head. "No, ma'am, you don't. HOA authority doesn't override property rights or trespassing laws. You entered private property without consent, and according to multiple witnesses, you initiated physical contact with Mrs. Martinez." The situation was rapidly reversing itself. What Patricia had intended as Marcus's arrest was becoming her own legal problem. Officer Chen was now explaining that she could be charged with trespassing, assault, and filing a false police report. Marcus watched the proceedings with professional interest. Patricia's tactical error had been assuming that police officers wouldn't investigate her claims thoroughly. She had counted on his military background making him appear threatening, but instead, his cooperation and the evidence had exposed her deception. Janet Reynolds arrived at the scene after Sarah called her during the police investigation. The attorney quickly assessed the situation and advised Marcus and Sarah of their rights while documenting everything for potential civil action against the HOA board. "Officer," Janet addressed Officer Chen, "my clients have been victims of systematic harassment by this HOA board for months. Today's incident represents an escalation to criminal behavior, including trespassing and assault." She handed Officer Chen a folder containing all the excessive violation notices, photographs of the Martinez property taken without permission, and documentation of the board's financial irregularities that Marcus had uncovered. "This board has been operating outside its legal authority and targeting residents who challenge their methods," Janet explained. "Today's incident was a deliberate attempt to provoke my client into a confrontation they could use against him, officer." Chen reviewed Janet's documentation and realized he was dealing with a much larger pattern of problematic behavior. The HOA enforcement activities she described bordered on stalking and harassment, while the financial issues raised questions about potential fraud or embezzlement. Patricia recognized that her strategy had completely backfired. Instead of having Marcus arrested, she was now facing potential criminal charges while he was emerging as the victim of a coordinated harassment campaign. The police report would document her assault on Sarah, her trespassing on private property, and her false accusations against Marcus. Beverly was becoming increasingly agitated as she realized the legal implications of their actions. "This isn't fair. We were just trying to enforce community standards." "Ma'am," Officer Rodriguez explained, "community standards don't override criminal law. Trespassing is trespassing, regardless of your position in the HOA." The crowd of neighbors had grown larger, with many residents documenting the scene with their phones. Word was spreading quickly through the community that the HOA enforcement team had been caught trespassing and assaulting residents. Social media posts were already appearing on neighborhood forums, sharing videos and photos of Patricia being questioned by police. Marcus observed the shift in community dynamics with professional interest. Patricia's authority had been built on the perception that she held legitimate power that residents couldn't challenge. Now that perception was crumbling in full view of the entire neighborhood. Her dramatic overreach had accomplished what months of reasonable opposition couldn't achieve. It had exposed her methods to public scrutiny and legal accountability. "Officer," Chen made his decision based on the evidence and witness statements. "Ms. Williams, you're being cited for trespassing and simple assault. Mrs. Thompson, you're being cited for trespassing and filing a false police report." Both women were shocked by the turn of events. Patricia had expected to watch Marcus being handcuffed and arrested, not to receive criminal citations herself. The reality of facing court appearances, potential criminal records, and civil liability was beginning to sink in. "This is ridiculous," Patricia protested. "We're respected members of this community." "That may be," Officer Chen replied, "but respect doesn't give you the right to break the law." As the police officers completed their reports and prepared to leave, Janet Reynolds addressed the gathered neighbors. "If anyone else has experienced similar harassment from this HOA board, please contact my office. What happened here today is part of a larger pattern of illegal behavior that needs to be addressed." Several residents approached Janet immediately, sharing their own stories of HOA overreach and requesting her business card. The Patel family described being fined for cultural decorations, while the Morrison family explained their battles over their son's basketball hoop. Mrs. Kowalski, the elderly widow, tearfully recounted being cited for having a medical equipment delivery truck in her driveway. Marcus realized that Patricia's actions had accomplished something he couldn't have achieved through legal proceedings. Alone, she had unified the neighborhood against the HOA board's methods and given other victims the courage to speak up publicly. As the police cars drove away, Patricia and Beverly found themselves standing alone while neighbors clustered around Marcus, Sarah, and Janet Reynolds. The shift in community support was obvious and dramatic. Patricia's authority, built over 5 years of intimidation and control, had evaporated in a single afternoon. Sarah was receiving medical attention from Linda Harrison, who was a retired nurse. The scrape on her elbow would heal, but the emotional impact of being assaulted in her own backyard would take longer to process. Marcus stayed close to his wife, understanding that she was dealing with the shock of being physically attacked by someone she had tried to reason with peacefully. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly, checking her bandaged elbow. "I'm fine physically," Sarah replied, "but I can't believe she actually pushed me down. I was just trying to protect our property." Marcus nodded, recognizing that his wife was experiencing the same confusion he had felt during his first combat encounter, the disbelief that someone would actually initiate violence over what seemed like a manageable disagreement. Janet Reynolds was already planning the next phase of legal action. "Marcus, this incident gives us everything we need for both criminal prosecution and a comprehensive civil lawsuit. Patricia's assault on Sarah, combined with the pattern of harassment we've documented, will result in significant damages and injunctive relief." The attorney looked around at the gathered neighbors. "More importantly, we now have multiple victims willing to testify in a community that understands what's been happening. This isn't just about your family anymore. It's about reforming how HOA boards operate in this entire area." As the crowd began to disperse, Tom Harrison approached Marcus with a serious expression. "Marcus, several of us have been talking. We want to organize a recall election to remove the entire board and start over with new leadership." "That's a good idea," Marcus replied, "but make sure you follow proper procedures and document everything carefully. They'll challenge any recall attempt if you give them grounds to do so." The afternoon's events had transformed the neighborhood dynamic completely. Patricia's authority was broken. Her methods were exposed as illegal, and the community was mobilizing against her leadership. What she had intended as Marcus's downfall had become her own destruction. Marcus helped Sarah into their house, where they could finally process what had happened in private. The immediate crisis was over, but the implications would continue unfolding for weeks to come. Patricia Williams had declared war on the wrong family, and now she was facing the consequences of that decision. 3 months later, the transformation of Maple Ridge Drive was complete and dramatic. The recall election had removed Patricia Williams, Robert Chen, Beverly Thompson, and Dorothy Nash from the HOA board by overwhelming margins. James Wilson, the only board member who had shown integrity during the crisis, had resigned voluntarily and recommended a complete restructuring of the community association's operations. The new board consisted of Tom Harrison as president, Linda Harrison as secretary, Dr. Patel as treasurer, and 2 other residents who had been victims of the previous board's harassment. Their first official action was to rescind all excessive fines issued over the past 2 years and refund money to residents who had been forced to pay illegal penalties. Marcus had been asked to serve on the new board but declined, preferring to return to his security consulting business and normal family life. However, he had helped draft new bylaws that included strict oversight procedures, transparent financial reporting, and clear limits on enforcement authority. The new regulations specifically prohibited board members from conducting business with the HOA and required community votes on any fines exceeding the original $25 limit. Janet Reynolds had successfully prosecuted the civil lawsuit against the former board members. Patricia Williams was ordered to pay $15,000 in damages to the Martinez family and faced additional lawsuits from other residents she had harassed. Her landscaping company was banned from community property, and she was prohibited from holding any HOA position in the future. The financial audit revealed that over $60,000 in community funds had been improperly spent on contracts with board members' businesses. Robert Chen's accounting firm was forced to refund excessive fees, and Beverly Thompson faced charges for using HOA resources to finance her surveillance activities. More significantly, the case had attracted attention from state legislators who were drafting new laws to regulate HOA board authority and prevent similar abuses in other communities. Marcus had been invited to testify before a state legislative committee about HOA reform, drawing on his experience to help protect other residents from harassment by power-hungry board members. Sarah had returned to her normal routine of teaching kindergarten, but she had gained new confidence from surviving the ordeal and seeing justice prevailed. The scrape on her elbow had healed within days, but the knowledge that she had stood up to bullies and helped protect her neighbors would stay with her permanently. The Martinez family had become informal leaders in the community, not through seeking power, but through demonstrating integrity under pressure. Neighbors frequently consulted Marcus about property issues, legal questions, and community decisions. His military background, which Patricia had tried to use against him, was now viewed by residents as an asset that brought valuable skills to civilian problems. Patricia Williams had moved out of Maple Ridge Drive within 6 weeks of the police incident, unable to face the daily reminder of her downfall and the neighbors who now viewed her as a criminal rather than a community leader. She sold her house at a loss and relocated to a different county, but her reputation followed her through. Social media posts and news articles about the HOA scandal. Beverly Thompson had also left the neighborhood after facing social ostracism and multiple lawsuits from residents whose privacy she had violated. Her obsessive documentation of neighbors' activities was now being used as evidence against her in court proceedings. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that her own photographs were proving her guilt. Robert Chen remained in the neighborhood, but kept a low profile, focusing on rebuilding his accounting practices' reputation. After losing several clients over the HOA scandal, he had publicly apologized for his role in the harassment campaign and cooperated fully with the financial audit, which helped reduce his legal penalties. The community center where the original hearing had taken place now hosted monthly meetings that were well attended and transparent. Residents participated actively in decision-making, and the new board encouraged input rather than discouraging questions. The atmosphere was cooperative rather than adversarial, with genuine focus on maintaining property values and community standards through reasonable methods. Marcus often reflected on how the conflict had resolved itself through Patricia's own overreach rather than through his strategic planning. His military training had prepared him to analyze threats and develop appropriate responses, but ultimately his enemy had defeated herself by escalating beyond what the community would tolerate. The incident had also strengthened his marriage with Sarah. Going through adversity together had reinforced their partnership and demonstrated their ability to support each other under pressure. Sarah's courage in standing up to Patricia's trespassing and Marcus's controlled response to provocation had shown both of them qualities in their spouse they hadn't fully appreciated before. On a warm Saturday morning in early spring, Marcus was working in his garden when Tom Harrison approached with a cup of coffee and a satisfied smile. The two men had become close friends through their shared experience of fighting HOA overreach and working to establish better community governance. "You know," Tom said, settling onto Marcus's patio chair, "I never thought I'd say this, but Patricia Williams did us all a favor." Marcus looked up from planting roses, considering the observation. "How do you figure?" "Think about it," Tom explained. "If she had just continued with the petty harassment and excessive fines, she might have gotten away with it for years. But when she escalated to trespassing and assault, she gave us everything we needed to stop her permanently." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Military strategists call that tactical overreach. She won several small battles and got overconfident, then made a major strategic error that lost her the entire war. Sarah emerged from the house carrying lemonade for both men, her presence a reminder of how much their lives had improved since the crisis ended. She was wearing a sundress and gardening gloves, looking relaxed and happy in a way that hadn't been possible during the months of HOA harassment. "Are you two still analyzing Patricia's downfall?" she asked with an amused smile. "Just appreciating how well things worked out," Marcus replied, accepting the lemonade and pulling Sarah down for a quick kiss. The neighborhood around them was peaceful and well-maintained, but now the standards were maintained through community cooperation, rather than authoritarian enforcement. Children played in yards without their parents worrying about violation notices. Neighbors chatted freely without fear of being reported for minor infractions. The Martinez house had become an unofficial community center where residents felt comfortable stopping by to discuss neighborhood issues or simply enjoy conversation with people who had proven their integrity under pressure. Marcus and Sarah had never sought leadership roles, but their principled stand against harassment had earned them respect that couldn't be demanded or legislated. As the three friends sat in comfortable silence, watching their neighbors enjoy a beautiful Saturday morning, it was clear that Maple Ridge Drive had become the kind of community it had always had the potential to be. Sometimes, Marcus reflected, the best victories were the ones where everyone, except the bullies, ended up winning. The HOA clash that had started with petty violations and escalated to criminal assault had ultimately transformed an entire neighborhood, proving that principled resistance to abuse of power could create positive change that extended far beyond the original conflict. Patricia Williams had learned too late that some people don't back down when pushed, especially when they have the skills, integrity, and community support to push back effectively.